In the shadows of an old barn, Beatrice thought her world had ended, but when a simple farmhand found her there, broken and abandoned, his unexpected act of kindness would change everything she believed about love, class, and redemption. The morning mist clung to Millbrook Valley like a shroud, wrapping itself around the towering oak trees that lined the pathway to Ashford Manor. Beatrice Ashford stood before the grand mirror in her childhood bedroom, her wedding dress cascading around her like spilled moonlight. The ivory silk, adorned with her grandmother's pearls, had taken months to complete, every stitch a testament to the hope that this day would restore her family's crumbling fortune. But hope, she would soon learn, was a luxury her family could no longer afford. The chapel bells of St. Margaret's had been ringing for nearly an hour, their bronze voices echoing across the valley with increasing urgency. Guests filled the wooden pews below, their whispered conversations creating a nervous hum that drifted through the stained glass windows. Among them sat the most prominent families of the county, all waiting to witness what they believed would be the salvation of the Ashford name. Beatrice's fingers trembled as she adjusted the delicate veil that had belonged to 3 generations of Ashford brides. Her reflection stared back, with eyes that held more fear than joy, more duty than desire. At 22, she had accepted that love was a privilege reserved for those who could afford it, and the Ashfords, despite their grand manor and sprawling lands, had been drowning in debt for years. "Miss Beatrice?" came the gentle voice of Mrs. Henley, the family's aging housekeeper, as she knocked softly on the door. "They're asking for you downstairs. The carriage is ready." Through the window, Beatrice could see the ornate carriage that would carry her to what felt more like an execution than a wedding. Her betrothed, Lord Pemberton, was a man twice her age, with thin lips and calculating eyes. He had made no secret of his interest in the Ashford lands rather than the Ashford daughter, but her father had presented the arrangement as their only salvation. The chapel of St. Margaret stood like a guardian over the valley, its stone walls weathered by centuries of joy and sorrow. As Beatrice's carriage approached, she could see the familiar faces of neighbors and distant relatives gathered on the steps. But something felt wrong. The crowd seemed restless, their conversations more animated than appropriate for such a solemn occasion. Father Whitmore appeared at the chapel door, his usually serene expression clouded with concern. He approached the carriage as it came to a halt, his weathered hands clasped tightly before him. "Miss Ashford," he began, his voice heavy with a burden she did not yet understand, "I'm afraid there has been a development." The world seemed to tilt beneath her as Father Whitmore explained that Lord Pemberton had departed before dawn, leaving behind only a brief letter. The contents, he revealed with obvious discomfort, detailed the Lord's discovery of debts far greater than he had been led to believe. The Ashford estate, it seemed, was beyond even his considerable means to rescue. Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face as the full weight of betrayal settled upon her shoulders. Not only had she been abandoned, but the very foundation of her family's deception had crumbled beneath the scrutiny of a man who had never intended to love her anyway. The whispers of the gathered guests grew louder, some sympathetic, others tinged with the cruel satisfaction that often accompanies another's downfall. Beatrice could feel their eyes upon her like physical weights, each glance adding to the crushing shame that threatened to steal her breath. Without a word to Father Whitmore or anyone else, she gathered the heavy skirts of her wedding dress and fled. Her silk slippers, meant for dancing at her wedding reception, carried her away from the chapel and down the winding dirt road that led toward the forgotten corners of the valley. She ran until her lungs burned and her carefully arranged hair began to escape its pins. The weight of the dress made every step more difficult, but she pushed forward, driven by a desperate need to escape the pitying looks and whispered judgments of people who had once curtsied to her family name. The old Thornfield barn appeared like a sanctuary in the distance, its weathered wood and sagging roof a stark contrast to the grandeur she was fleeing. It had been abandoned for years, used only occasionally by local farmers for storage during harvest time. Most importantly, it was empty, forgotten, and far from the eyes of those who had witnessed her humiliation. Beatrice stumbled through the heavy wooden door and collapsed among the scattered hay that covered the barn floor. The wedding dress, once pristine and hopeful, spread around her like the petals of a wilted flower. Here, in the dusty shadows where sunlight filtered through broken boards, she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just occurred. Her sobs echoed in the empty space, mixing with the distant sound of wind through the eaves. Everything she had been raised to believe about duty, sacrifice, and the natural order of things had crumbled in a single morning. The future that had been mapped out for her, unpleasant as it was, had vanished, leaving only uncertainty and shame in its wake. As the afternoon shadows grew longer across the barn floor, Beatrice remained where she had fallen, her wedding dress now stained with dirt and tears. She had no idea that beyond the barn walls, someone was approaching on foot, drawn by curiosity about the elegant carriage that had been seen heading toward the abandoned building. The sound of footsteps on gravel would soon change everything. Isaiah Thorne had been walking the same dirt path to Thornfield Barn for 3 years, ever since old Mr. Thornfield had given him permission to store his modest farming tools in the unused building. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley as he approached, his weathered boots crunching softly on the gravel road that wound between overgrown hedgerows. At 28, Isaiah carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to find worth in honest work rather than inherited titles. His hands, calloused from years of tending other people's land, carried a small bundle of oats he planned to store for the winter months ahead. The abandoned barn had become a refuge of sorts, a place where he could tend to his few possessions without the watchful eyes of the estate owners who employed him. But as he drew closer to the familiar structure, something caught his attention that made him pause. Wheel marks in the soft earth, too fine and too fresh to belong to any farm cart he knew. The tracks led directly to the barn's entrance, and through the partially open door he glimpsed something that made his breath catch in his throat. Ivory silk gleamed like captured starlight against the dusty barn floor. Isaiah approached slowly, uncertainty weighing each step. The sight that greeted him inside the barn door would remain etched in his memory forever. A young woman sat collapsed among the scattered hay, her elaborate wedding dress spread around her like the wings of a fallen angel. Her dark hair had escaped its careful arrangement, tumbling around her shoulders in waves that caught the golden light filtering through the broken roof. She was weeping with the kind of abandon that comes only when one believes themselves completely alone. For a moment, Isaiah stood frozen in the doorway, torn between retreat and concern. He had never seen grief so raw, so complete, and something in the sight stirred a protective instinct he had not known he possessed. This was clearly a lady of quality, her dress alone worth more than he earned in several years. Yet here she sat in an abandoned barn, as broken as any creature he had ever encountered. "Miss," he called softly, his voice gentle as a prayer. "Are you hurt?" Beatrice's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and shame. Through her tears, she saw a man standing in the doorway, his simple work clothes and sun-weathered face marking him as clearly as if he wore a sign declaring his station. Her first instinct was to order him away, to maintain the distance that society demanded between their classes, but the words died in her throat. There was no judgment in his eyes, only concern as pure and honest as spring water. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. I should not be here." Isaiah stepped carefully into the barn, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "This barn belongs to no one in particular, miss. If you need shelter, you're welcome to it." He paused, studying her face with the careful attention of a man accustomed to reading the subtle signs of pain in wounded animals. "But forgive me for saying so, you look as though you've had quite a shock." Something in his gentle tone broke through the last of Beatrice's composure. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks as she tried to gather the voluminous skirts of her wedding dress, suddenly aware of how she must appear. I was to be married today, but Lord Pemberton." The words caught in her throat like thorns. Isaiah felt his jaw tighten at the mention of the name. Lord Pemberton was known throughout the valley as a man who measured everything, including people, by their monetary worth. "I see," he said quietly, though the full picture was beginning to form in his mind. "And now you find yourself here instead of at your wedding breakfast." "There will be no wedding," Beatrice said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He left this morning when he learned that my family's situation is not what he was led to believe." The shame in her voice was so profound that Isaiah felt it like a physical ache in his own chest. He moved closer, his steps careful and measured. From his pocket he withdrew a clean handkerchief, worn soft from many washings but spotlessly clean. "Here," he offered, extending it toward her. "You needn't explain anything to me, miss. Sometimes the world deals us blows that feel too heavy to bear." Beatrice stared at the simple piece of cloth as if it were the most precious gift she had ever been offered. When she reached for it, their fingers brushed briefly, and she was struck by the gentleness of his calloused hands. "You are very kind," she managed, "but I fear kindness is more than I deserve today." "Every person deserves kindness," Isaiah replied firmly, "especially when they're carrying more sorrow than one heart should hold." He settled himself on a nearby hay bale, maintaining a respectful distance while making it clear he had no intention of leaving her alone. "Might I ask your name, miss? I'd like to know what to call the lady I'm pleased to help." "Beatrice," she answered after a moment's hesitation. "Beatrice Ashford." Isaiah nodded, filing away the information without the change in expression that usually accompanied recognition of the Ashford name. He had heard the stories, of course, the whispered tales of declining fortunes and mounting debts that followed the old families of the valley like shadows. But looking at this broken young woman in her ruined wedding dress, he saw only a person in need of comfort. "Well then, Miss Beatrice," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to wrap around her like a blanket, "I'm Isaiah Thorne, and I'm honored to make your acquaintance, though I wish it were under happier circumstances." Something in the way he spoke her name, without the formal distance she was accustomed to, but with genuine respect, made fresh tears spring to her eyes. Not tears of grief this time, but something closer to relief. Here was a man who looked at her and saw neither her family's shame nor her personal humiliation, but simply a fellow human being in need of care. "Mr. Thorne," she said, testing the unfamiliar territory of addressing a man of his station with such courtesy, "I fear I have imposed upon your goodness long enough. This must be your refuge, and I have invaded it with my troubles." "This barn has stood empty more often than not," Isaiah replied with a gentle smile. "I can't think of a better use for it than sheltering someone who needs peace." He paused, studying her face with growing concern. "Have you eaten today, Miss Beatrice, or had anything to drink?" The question brought her back to immediate realities she had forgotten in her emotional turmoil. She realized she had consumed nothing since the early morning, too nervous about the wedding to manage breakfast. No, I haven't." Isaiah rose from his place on the hay bale, decision made. "Then, if you'll permit me, I'll fetch some provisions. There's a spring not far from here with the sweetest water in the valley, and I believe I can manage something more substantial as well." As he moved toward the door, Beatrice called after him, "Mr. Thorne, why are you helping me? You owe me nothing, and society would tell you that helping me compromises us both." Isaiah paused in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the golden afternoon light. "Society has a great many opinions about a great many things, Miss Beatrice, but when I see someone hurting, I don't consult society before offering help. I consult my conscience, and my conscience tells me that kindness is never wrong." With that, he disappeared into the afternoon sun, leaving Beatrice alone with thoughts that felt entirely different from the despair that had consumed her only hours before. Isaiah returned to the barn as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose. In his arms, he carried a simple wicker basket covered with a clean cloth, and over his shoulder hung a leather water pouch that gleamed with condensation from the cold spring water within. Beatrice had not moved from where he had left her, though she had used his handkerchief to clean her face and had attempted to arrange her wedding dress in a more modest fashion. The sight of her trying to maintain dignity despite her circumstances stirred something protective in Isaiah's chest, a feeling he had not experienced since childhood. "The spring water here is said to have healing properties," Isaiah said as he approached, his voice gentle to avoid startling her. "The old wives of the valley swear it can mend everything from broken bones to broken hearts." A small smile, the first genuine expression of warmth Beatrice had shown that day, touched her lips. "I fear my heart may require more than spring water to heal, Mr. Thorne. But I am grateful for your thoughtfulness." Isaiah settled the basket beside her and uncorked the water pouch, offering it with the same careful courtesy he might show a duchess. "Perhaps not," he said quietly. "But healing often begins with small kindnesses, and sometimes what seems impossible at sunset appears quite manageable by dawn." Blah. As Beatrice drank, Isaiah unpacked the contents of his basket with movements that spoke of practiced efficiency. Fresh bread, still warm from his modest cottage oven, a small wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth, early autumn apples that gleamed like jewels in the fading light, and a jar of honey that caught the golden rays streaming through the barn's broken roof. "This is far too generous," Beatrice protested, though her stomach betrayed her with an audible response to the sight of food. "I cannot accept such bounty from someone who clearly has so little to spare." Isaiah paused in his unpacking, his hands stilling as he considered her words. "Miss Beatrice, if I may speak plainly, I suspect you've spent your life surrounded by people who measure generosity by the size of their estates rather than the size of their hearts. I may have little in material wealth, but I have enough to share with someone in need, and that makes me richer than many lords I could name." The simple eloquence of his words, delivered without pretension or self-consciousness, struck Beatrice with unexpected force. She had never heard a working man speak with such confidence about his place in the world, nor had she encountered someone who seemed to find genuine contentment in circumstances that society would consider humble. "You speak as though you have known lords personally," she observed, accepting the piece of bread he offered, with hands that trembled slightly. "I have worked the lands around 3 great estates," Isaiah replied, settling himself on the hay beside her basket, maintaining a respectful distance while ensuring she did not feel abandoned. "I've seen how wealth can elevate the soul, or poison it, just as I've seen how poverty can either embitter a man or teach him what truly matters." As they shared the simple meal, conversation flowed with surprising ease. Isaiah spoke of his travels throughout the valley, his observations of nature and season, his small dreams of perhaps owning a modest plot of land someday where he could grow things for the pure joy of watching them flourish. His words painted pictures of a life lived with intention and purpose, unburdened by the weight of societal expectations that had shaped every day of Beatrice's existence. In return, Beatrice found herself speaking of things she had never voiced aloud, the suffocating pressure of maintaining appearances while her family's fortune crumbled around them. The nights she had lain awake, wondering what would become of the estate workers who depended on Ashford lands for their livelihoods. The deep loneliness of being raised as a commodity to be traded rather than a person to be cherished. "I sometimes think," she said, her voice growing thoughtful as the shadows lengthened, "that I have lived my entire life preparing for a future that was never truly mine to claim. Every lesson, every accomplishment, every carefully cultivated skill was designed to make me more appealing to a man like Lord Pemberton." Isaiah studied her face in the golden light, noting the intelligence that sparkled in her eyes despite her earlier tears. "And what would you have chosen for yourself if the choice had been yours alone? The question was so unexpected, so foreign to everything Beatrice had been taught about a woman's place in the world, that she found herself speechless for several moments. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the wonder of someone discovering a truth she had long buried. "I used to read everything I could find about distant places," she said slowly. "Books about explorers and naturalists, accounts of archaeological discoveries, stories of women who had carved out lives of purpose and meaning beyond the boundaries of drawing rooms and dinner parties. I dreamed of seeing the world, of contributing something meaningful to it, rather than simply existing as an ornament in someone else's life." "Those dreams," Isaiah said gently, "they haven't died simply because today didn't unfold as planned. Sometimes what feels like an ending is actually a beginning disguised." Before Beatrice could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the valley. Both of them tensed, recognizing the particular rhythm of horses being ridden hard rather than merely traveling. Through the gaps in the barn walls, they could see a small group of riders approaching along the main road. "They're likely searching for you," Isaiah observed, his voice calm despite the tension that had suddenly filled the air. "Your family will be worried." Beatrice felt panic rise in her chest as the reality of her situation crashed back over her. "I cannot face them yet," she whispered, the shame, the disappointment in their eyes. "I am not strong enough." Isaiah moved with quiet decisiveness, gathering the remains of their meal and securing the water pouch. "There's a loft above us," he said, indicating a ladder that led to the upper reaches of the barn. "You can remain hidden there until they pass. I'll remain below and give them no reason to search further." As the hoofbeats drew closer, Beatrice allowed Isaiah to help her to her feet, her voluminous wedding dress making movement awkward. "Mr. Thorne," she said urgently, "if they discover you helped me, there could be consequences. The difference in our stations—" "Let me worry about consequences," Isaiah interrupted gently but firmly. "Right now, the only thing that matters is keeping you safe until you're ready to face whatever comes next." The way he spoke, with such quiet certainty and protective determination, made Beatrice's heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear. As she climbed toward the safety of the loft, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a ghostly reminder of the day's events, she realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of the world. Here was a man who asked nothing of her except the privilege of helping, who offered protection without expectation of reward, who spoke to her as an equal despite every social convention that stood between them. The contrast with everything she had been taught to expect from men, particularly men of Lord Pemberton's class, was so stark it left her breathless. From her hiding place in the loft, she watched through the gaps in the floorboards as Isaiah calmly continued his work in the barn below, giving every appearance of a man going about his normal evening routine. When the search party arrived, she heard him speak with them briefly, his voice carrying just the right note of helpful concern as he directed them toward other possible locations where a distressed young lady might seek shelter. Only when the last hoofbeat had faded into the distance did Beatrice realize she had been holding her breath, not from fear of discovery, but from the realization that in a single afternoon a humble farm worker had shown her more genuine care and protection than she had ever received from the aristocratic world she had been born to inhabit. The riders had been gone for nearly an hour before Isaiah deemed it safe for Beatrice to descend from the loft. Evening had settled over the valley like a gentle embrace, bringing with it the cool air that carried the scent of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke. As she climbed down carefully, her wedding dress catching on the rough wooden ladder, she felt as though she were descending not just from the barn's upper reaches, but from one version of her life into another entirely. "They won't return tonight," Isaiah assured her, offering his hand to steady her as she reached the ground. "But come morning, they'll likely expand their search. Your family will be beside themselves with worry." Beatrice accepted his assistance, noting how his calloused palm felt both rough and gentle against her own soft fingers. "My family," she said, with a bitter laugh that held no humour. "I wonder if their worry stems from concern for my well-being, or fear of the scandal my disappearance will bring to the Ashford name." Isaiah studied her face in the dim light that filtered through the barn's openings. There was something in her tone, a hardness that hadn't been there earlier, that spoke of wounds deeper than a single day's disappointment. "You speak as though love and reputation cannot coexist in your world." Perhaps they cannot," Beatrice replied, settling herself on a bale of hay with movements that had grown more natural throughout the day. "My father arranged my engagement to Lord Pemberton not because he believed the man would cherish me, but because he needed Pemberton's money to save what remains of our estate. When I protested that I barely knew the man, Papa reminded me that love was a luxury we could no longer afford." The pain in her voice was so raw that Isaiah felt it like a physical ache in his own chest. He had always known that the great families of the valley lived by rules different from those that governed his simple world, but hearing the reality described so starkly filled him with an anger he struggled to contain. "And yet," he said carefully, "your father's plan has failed regardless. The marriage is broken, the money will not come, and you remain unmarried. Perhaps this is an opportunity to choose a different path." Beatrice shook her head, her expression growing troubled. "You don't understand the full scope of our situation, Mr. Thorne. The debts are not merely substantial, they are overwhelming. Without Lord Pemberton's intervention, we face complete ruin within months. The estate will be sold, the workers dismissed, and my family will be left with nothing but the charity of distant relatives who will take us in out of duty rather than affection." Isaiah was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what she had shared. In his world, poverty was a familiar companion, but it was honest poverty, faced and fought with dignity and hard work. The kind of genteel destitution that threatened the Ashfords seemed far more cruel in its way, offering the mockery of past grandeur while stripping away any real power to change one's circumstances. "There must be something that can be done," he said finally, "some way to save what matters most without sacrificing your happiness entirely." "The only valuable asset remaining is the land itself," Beatrice replied with resignation. "But Papa refuses to sell it piecemeal, claiming it would destroy the family legacy. He would rather see the entire estate lost than admit that our time as landed gentry has come to an end." As she spoke, something began to stir in Isaiah's mind, a possibility so audacious it took his breath away. He had spent years walking every acre of the valley, had worked lands belonging to 3 different estates, and had observed the careful negotiations that occurred when property changed hands. More importantly, he had saved every penny he could spare, dreaming of the day he might purchase a modest plot for himself. "Miss Beatrice," he said slowly, his voice carrying a strange new tension. "What if there were someone willing to purchase portions of the estate, someone who understood its value not just in terms of money, but in terms of the lives and livelihoods it supports?" She looked at him with confusion, not understanding the direction of his thoughts. "Such a person would need to possess considerable wealth, Mr. Thorne, the kind of wealth that comes with titles and inheritance, not honest labor." Isaiah rose from his seat and began pacing the small confines of the barn, his mind working rapidly through calculations he had never dared make before. "You might be surprised," he said quietly, "what a man can accumulate when he lives simply and saves carefully for many years." Something in his tone made Beatrice study his face more intently. In the gathering darkness, she could see the play of emotions across his weathered features, the careful consideration of a man weighing possibilities that seemed to surprise even him. "Mr. Thorne," she said slowly, "what are you suggesting?" Isaiah stopped his pacing and turned to face her directly. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet determination that sent tremors through her heart. "I am suggesting that perhaps your family's salvation doesn't require a Lord Pemberton, Perhaps it requires someone who values the land for what it truly is, rather than what it represents. You cannot mean, Beatrice began, but the words died in her throat as the full implication of his suggestion began to dawn on her. I have been saving for 15 years, Isaiah continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. Every spare coin, every small profit from my labor. I had always dreamed of owning a small farm, perhaps 50 acres where I could grow crops and raise a modest herd. But what if instead of purchasing land from strangers, I were to invest in property I already know and love, in partnership with people who understand its true value? The idea was so revolutionary, so far outside the bounds of everything Beatrice had been taught about social order and proper behavior, that she found herself speechless. A common laborer purchasing portions of aristocratic lands, entering into partnership with a family whose bloodline traced back centuries. The very notion challenged every assumption about class and privilege that had shaped her understanding of the world. My father would never consent to such an arrangement, she whispered, though even as she spoke the words, she could hear the doubt in her own voice. Desperation, she was learning, had a way of making the impossible seem merely improbable. Your father, Isaiah said gently, might find himself with little choice in the matter. A partial sale to someone who promises to maintain the estate's character and protect its workers might seem preferable to complete financial ruin. Before Beatrice could respond, the sound of a single horse approaching at a moderate pace echoed across the valley. This time, there was no urgency in the hoofbeats, no sense of frantic searching. Instead, the rhythm suggested someone who knew exactly where they were going. Through the gaps in the barn walls, they could see a lone rider silhouetted against the starlit sky. As the figure drew closer, Beatrice gasped in recognition. "It's my father," she breathed, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and apprehension. Lord Henry Ashford dismounted from his horse with the careful movements of a man no longer young, his shoulders bowed under burdens that had little to do with physical weight. He approached the barn slowly, deliberately, like a man walking toward a conversation he had been dreading all day. "Beatrice," he called softly, his voice carrying none of the anger she had expected. "I know you're here, child. Mrs. Henley saw you heading toward the old Thornfield place, and the search party confirmed that someone had been sheltering in this barn." Isaiah stepped forward, placing himself between Beatrice and the door, in a gesture that was both protective and respectful. "Lord Ashford," he said with quiet dignity, "your daughter is safe and unharmed. She has been under my protection this evening." Lord Ashford paused in the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior of the barn. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to age him before their eyes. "Mr. Thorne, is it not? I remember you from the Fairhaven estate." His gaze moved to his daughter, taking in her stained wedding dress and dishevelled appearance, with what looked like genuine sorrow rather than anger. "Beatrice, my dear girl, we need to talk." Lord Henry Ashford stood in the doorway of the barn, like a man gazing upon the ruins of his own making. The morning light that had once illuminated his daughter's wedding preparations now cast long shadows across a scene that would have been unthinkable just days before. His aristocratic daughter, in her ruined wedding gown, seeking comfort in the company of a humble farm worker who had shown her more kindness than any lord of her acquaintance. "Papa," Beatrice said softly, rising from her place among the hay. Despite everything that had transpired, the sight of her father's aged and weary face stirred the deep affection that had always existed between them, buried though it had been beneath layers of duty and expectation. "My dear child," Lord Ashford replied, his voice heavy with emotions he struggled to contain. "When Lord Pemberton's letter arrived this morning, followed by your disappearance, I feared I had lost everything that truly mattered, in pursuit of preserving things that perhaps never mattered at all." Isaiah stepped forward with quiet dignity, his presence commanding respect despite the vast difference in their social stations. "Lord Ashford, before you speak with your daughter, there is something I must say. I have made a proposal to Miss Beatrice, and I believe it deserves your consideration." Lord Ashford's eyebrows rose, though whether in surprise or offence was difficult to determine. "A proposal, Mr. Thorn? In what capacity do you presume to make proposals to my daughter?" "In the capacity of a man who has spent 15 years saving every coin he could spare," Isaiah replied steadily. "And more importantly, in the capacity of a man who has come to care deeply for Miss Beatrice's welfare, not as a commodity to be traded, but as a person deserving of happiness and respect." The silence that followed was so complete that the distant sound of birdsong seemed to echo like thunder through the barn. Lord Ashford studied Isaiah's face with the careful attention of a man reassessing everything he thought he knew about the natural order of the world. "You speak of caring for my daughter," Lord Ashford said slowly, "and yet you are a working man, while she is the daughter of a noble house. Surely you understand the impossibility of what you suggest." "I understand the improbability of it," Isaiah corrected gently. "But I have learned that impossibility and improbability are not the same thing. Your daughter faces ruin because she was promised to a man who valued her inheritance more than her heart. I offer her partnership with a man who values her heart more than any inheritance." Beatrice felt her breath catch at the simple eloquence of his words. In all her life, no one had ever spoken of her value in such terms, as though her thoughts and feelings and dreams were treasures more precious than any estate or title. Lord Ashford was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a surprising note of curiosity rather than dismissal. "And this partnership you propose, Mr. Thorn, what form would it take?" Isaiah straightened his shoulders, meeting the Lord's gaze with unwavering confidence. "I have accumulated enough savings to purchase significant portions of the Ashford estate, not as an outsider seeking to profit from your family's misfortune, but as someone who understands the true value of the land and the people who depend upon it. I propose a partnership that would preserve the estate's character while ensuring its financial stability. You would become a landowner," Lord Ashford said, and for the first time there was something approaching respect in his voice. "A gentleman farmer in your own right." "I would become a steward of something beautiful and meaningful," Isaiah replied. "And if Miss Beatrice would consent to it, I would become her husband not because society demands it or because financial necessity requires it, but because I love her with a devotion that neither wealth nor poverty could diminish." The words hung in the air like a benediction, transforming the dusty barn into a cathedral where impossible dreams suddenly seemed within reach. Beatrice felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were not the tears of despair that had marked the morning's beginning. These were tears of wonder at the discovery that love, real love, had been possible all along. "Beatrice," her father said gently, turning to study her face with new attention, "what does your heart tell you about this extraordinary proposal?" Beatrice looked between the two men who had shaped this remarkable day, her father who had loved her imperfectly but genuinely, and Isaiah who had shown her what love could be when it was freely given rather than strategically arranged. When she spoke, her voice carried a strength that surprised even her. "My heart tells me that I have spent my entire life preparing to be someone else's ornament," she said. "But here, in this humble barn, with this good man, I have discovered who I truly am. I am not afraid of working beside him to build something meaningful. I am not ashamed to love a man whose worth is measured by the content of his character rather than the length of his lineage." Lord Ashford closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, something fundamental had shifted in his expression. "Then God forgive me for nearly destroying your chance at happiness in pursuit of preserving a legacy that was never as important as I believed it to be." He stepped forward and, to the amazement of both young people, extended his hand to Isaiah. "Mr. Thorn, If you can indeed provide the financial stability our estate requires, and if you promise to cherish my daughter as she deserves to be cherished, then you have my blessing to become not just a partner in our lands, but a son in our family." Isaiah grasped the offered hand with reverence, understanding the magnitude of the gesture. "I give you my word, sir, that I will spend my life proving worthy of the trust you place in me." Udis, as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the valley in shades of gold and green that seemed to celebrate the day's unexpected transformation, Beatrice felt something she had never experienced before, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to love. The scandal that had begun with a ruined wedding would become the foundation of a love story that the people of Millbrook Valley would remember for generations. The aristocratic lady who married her humble rescuer, not for duty or convenience, but for the pure joy of building a life with someone who saw her true worth. Years later, when visitors came to tour the thriving Ashford Thorne estate, they would hear the story of how a single day's heartbreak had led to a lifetime's happiness, how a barn that had once sheltered a broken dream became the birthplace of a love that proved the human heart recognizes no boundaries save those it chooses to honor. In that story, they would remember that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in the grand halls of expectation, but in the humble corners where wounded hearts dare to hope again. And sometimes, just sometimes, love truly is enough to transform not just two lives, but an entire world's understanding of what makes a life worth living. The wedding that took place 3 months later was smaller than the one that had been planned for Lord Pemberton, but it was filled with a joy so radiant that even the autumn flowers seemed to bloom more brightly in celebration of a love that had dared to grow in the most unlikely soil.